have one main goal in my talk, actually two. The first one is not to spill the water on my new computer. The second one is to argue for this claim. This is just premise. Many naturalists deny the possibility and legitimacy of a priori justification. But I will argue that this is a mistake, generally due to two main errors or two main reasons wrong. In some cases, this idea that naturalists shouldn't buy their priori is based on a wrong-headed conception of what their priori is. And the second one is, in some cases, people having an inadequate appreciation of what philosophical naturalism should be, and sometimes these two things go together. So I will argue for this thesis by looking at, actually, premise. There are two forms of, I think, nowadays of naturalism and philosophy. The first one has been called scientific naturalism. It's perhaps more mainstream, and Kant's more or less compliant. So ontological claim, there is an ontological claim, ontology should be defined by the natural sciences alone, and a methodological claim, the only acceptable methods for acquiring knowledge are the methods that are accepted and used in the natural sciences. And then there is a corollary about philosophy, that is, so how philosophy should be done. Philosophy shouldn't have any, should be continuous with the sciences, but from an ontological and methodological point of view. This, I think, is the standard view. There is another view, let's call it, has been called liberal naturalism, and people like John Dupré was mentioned, has been mentioned, or Patton in the last years, and McDowell, Strozen have been, Jennifer Hornsby have been defended versions of this view, according to which no entity or explanation should be accepted whose existence or truth would contradict the scientific view of the world. This is much looser than the other one. And this has, of course, a consequence for how philosophy should be done. And the idea is that it's not necessary that philosophy has to be continuous with the sciences. In some cases, of course, this is the case, but not in all the cases. The only constraint is that, as I said, they shouldn't. Our philosophical views shouldn't contradict the best scientific theories we have. So, for example, something like the intelligent design-based idea of evolution that Plantinga is defending, this is incompatible with its view. Or some forms of neo-Cartesianism wouldn't be acceptable. But other philosophical views are not incompatible with the scientific view of the world. So they should be, they are acceptable for liberal naturalists. That doesn't mean that they are correct at first, but they are at least acceptable. Now, this form of naturalism, liberal naturalism, doesn't really have a problem with a priori, because this is a form of pluralism in epistemology, so exactly a pluralism in epistemology, so they don't have a problem. But the other view, scientific naturalism, is normally taken as saying that the priori doesn't really work for a naturalist. And I think this is wrong. It's wrong for them also, and I will argue with this view. Okay, so normally the idea, I will be concentrating on a priori justification, because I take knowledge as standard, right? Justify true belief, perhaps plus something else, but at least if you have a priori knowledge, it means that you have a priori justification. Okay, so this is the real core of the issue. It's not so much about truth and any other factor, it's about justification, the issue of the a priori. And so here the standard definition of a priori justification. There are propositions that are justified independently of experience. And a priori justification can either be inferential. This happens when we see that the proposition logically follows from other propositions, or non-inferential, when the justification of the proposition is only based on its understanding. So these are two different forms. Sometimes they are confused, sometimes people don't consider that is also the first one. I mean, but these are the two forms of a priori, main forms of a priori justification. Now, there are several, actually I counted 8 reasons for which people think that their priori is not compatible with the scientific form of naturalism I defined at the beginning, the Quinian one, right? These are the typical 8 charges, and I will discuss each of them in turn. So the first is this, comes from Kant's definition of the priori. A priori justification is absolutely independent of all experience. So people say this cannot be a naturalistic theory, so the priori is unacceptable. Second, of course I will discuss them in turn. This is not discussion. It's only a list of why according to scientific naturalists, the priori is unacceptable. Second, a priori justification would require supernatural intuitions or some other mysterious modality, or epistemic modality, right? So it's unacceptable. Michael David has more or less said something similar. Then, a priori justification should be infallible, and so if it should be infallible, that's not acceptable for a naturalist. Should be undefeasible, and this is not acceptable again for people who endorse naturalism. That's the charge. Then, something. Okay. Only necessary truths could be justified a priori, but some naturalists deny that there are things as necessary truths. That's called sometimes defenders of moral factionalism. What really counts is this world. Who cares about the other world? Well, the other world, so perhaps they are not even acceptable from a naturalistic standpoint. That's a church. So who cares about necessary truths? Then another way. Only analytic truths could be justified a priori, but if you buy Quine's attack of analyticity, this shouldn't work, because according to this view, there are not real analytical judgments. I don't think Quine really proved that, but this is normally said, frequently said at least. There are no analytic truths, so who cares about ways of justifying things that don't exist? Empirically, one can see that there is a deep disagreement about rational intuitions, so they can't offer adequate justification. This comes from the empirical philosophy movement, right? So, if there is something as a priori justification, this is based on our intuitions, but our intuitions are really different from person to person. So what you reach is not really justification, because they are not universal. These intuitions are not universal, so the kind of justification you get from them is really something that is not valid universally. And the last one is, that's interesting, comes from some empiricist philosophers, perhaps in Jodifred, with which I sympathize in many respects, but none of this. A priori justification plays no role in scientific methodology, and so for a scientific naturalist, philosophy should be continuous with science even as to its methodology. So if you don't find anything like this in science, why should you care about using this method that is not a scientific one? That's the joke. So let's now analyze these 8 claims and in turn. So the first, I will try to reply to each of them, proving, I repeat, that even if you are a scientific naturalist, you shouldn't be affected by these 8 claims, and you should be happy with the idea that some sentences could be justified a priori. Even if you have to be careful to define what a priori means. That's of course part of it. So that's the Kant's definition. A priori justification and knowledge that is based, a priori knowledge is based on a priori justification, as I said, is absolutely independent of all experience. So this is Kant's definition. I agree that this is probably incompatible with scientific naturalism, but I don't think it's a good definition of what a priori is. A priori justification is. So this view presupposes the correctness of innativism in some Kantian way, not biological innatism, some transcendentally innatism, and this is something contentious. But I think it's not true that a priori justification is absolutely independent of all experience. I think as a matter of fact, as a matter of our knowledge of our minds, that experience is necessary for acquiring the concepts that are needed in order to understand the a priori justified propositions. It's not that we can really have any a priori justifications if we don't have no concepts that we acquire through experience. Okay, that's the point. So, for example, mathematical statements can easily be thought as justified a priori, but you need experience in order to acquire these concepts. Okay? The concepts that are needed for doing the a priori justification. So there is an important distinction here. Sometimes it's taken, can be taken probably correctly as saying that a priori justification is totally independent, even genetically, from experience. And I think this is factually not so. Okay? This is a third. So if you define the a priori correctly as, needing experience in some sense, as a genetic source of the concepts we need for a priori justification, then this charge doesn't work, and so can be used by the scientific naturalist who wants to deny the priori. Second charge, a priori justification would require something like supernatural or perhaps non-natural intuitions, okay? If this were true, of course, a priori justification would be something that the scientific naturalists shouldn't accept, and even liberal naturalists. If you need something that is non-natural for justifying, for having a priori justification, an epistemic source that is non-natural, perhaps incompatible with the naturalistic view of the world, the scientific view of the world, or something like that, I would buy this claim as well. This is made by Michael David. But I think that what really means here to have a priori justification is something different. You don't need any supernatural or non-natural intuition. To justify a priori proposition is to have a rational intuition or insights, immediate, non-inferential about its truth. This is the kind of a priori justification connected with single statements. Then you can also have a rational insight about deductions. But this is nothing that goes besides reason. It's nothing supernatural. So this kind of intuition or insight is based on either the understanding of the concepts involved, the justification, or the inability to think of counterexamples. Okay? You can conceive of counterexamples, so you are justified in a priori in accepting a thesis. This we'll see, it doesn't mean that the thesis is true, but you are justified a priori in accepting it. Laurence Bonjour and Bruce Russell have argued with that view, and I think it's very plausible. Okay, so there is no special. We are not talking about even the intuition that Husserl was talking about, or even the mystics or whatever. We are talking about a rational capacity that human beings normally endowed human beings have. Okay, as a matter of natural capacities. So even this, I don't think really works. So another very common charge is a priori justification should be infallible. That's very common, right? Perhaps the most sophisticated philosophers don't buy it, but it's very common to find that, the idea. A priori justification gives you infallible results. And so if it's infallible, that's incompatible with the natural, the scientific experience we have. When we test our scientific theories, even the best ones, we know that they are fallible. So why should infallibility be something we have to accept as natural? The point, I don't think that all a priori justifications are infallible. Perhaps in mathematics it's different, but the point to look, even if there are some a priori justifications, even one example of a priori justification that is not infallible is enough for saying that, in that case, we have to accept a priori justification. I think we could do more, but at least this would prove that the thesis is wrong. It's not true that all a priori justification is infallible. I think in some cases, justified beliefs are fallible. So we are justified in believing something on the basis of an a priori analysis, even if this is fallible. And I give a couple of examples. So, for example, that's from mathematics. The Goldbach conjecture, right? All even integers greater than 2 can be expressed as the sum of 2 primes. So, for example, 6 is 5 plus 1, right? And so on, up to all the examples we can count. we don't have a proof that this is actually true of all numbers. So this is in principle fallible. Even in mathematics, I've taken a difficult case. So we are totally justified in thinking that the Goldbach's conjecture is true, but we don't have a proof. So it's fallible in principle. So it's not true that a priori justification gives you infallible beliefs. Another case is, comes from Miller. If you have a heap of sand and you take away rain, right? That's a typical Sorides paradox. So you're justified in each case to say that the heap is there. If you take away one grain of sand from the heap, you will always get another heap. But eventually this is not true because you won't have a heap, you won't have anything at the end. So you are justified in thinking that each single passage gives you a heap. Every time you take away one grain of sand from the heap, you will get another heap. But eventually you know that that's not true, because eventually you won't have a heap again. So you are justified in any single case in believing that there will be a heap, but eventually you know that this is false. It's not true. You are justified in thinking so, but what you have proves that this application of this inferences is wrong somewhere. You know, the problem of vagueness is very difficult, but this is not in itself interesting. It's interesting only to know, to notice that we get beliefs that are well justified a priori, but still at some point they're false. And the last case, so that's the point. A false belief then can be justified a priori, but that doesn't mean that it is necessarily true. They are not infallible. So even also this chart does not really work. So another one, similar. But a priori justification should be undefeasible. That's another similar, more sophisticated view, because diffeasibility is defined that way. The arguments that support a particular belief are rationally compelling, but not deductively valid. That's diffeasibility. And people say, okay, but this applies to all our naturalistic-based views, but not to a priori justified beliefs. They are supposedly undefeasible, and that's unacceptable for a naturalist. That's the view, right? This is used, I repeat, by the scientific naturalist to say, oh, look, the a priori is not really acceptable for us, because it's really something different from the ways of knowing we accept that are only the naturalistic ones. Okay, I don't think that this is true. I think that there are at least some a priori justified beliefs that are defeasible. Some examples. That's it. Frank Jackson has defined it. I defended this view. Some expanded evidence could defeat them. Some expanded evidence could defeat the beliefs that we have justified a priori. Okay, that's an example. So takes the geometers before the non-Euclidean revolution. They had all the reason for what they knew then. They had all the reason to think that if you deny the fifth postulate of Euclid's geometry, you would get an inconsistent system. So they were justified in believing that Euclidean geometry is the only possible geometry. So the world, the external world, has to be Euclidean because this is the only possible geometry. Any denial of the fifth postulate would generate a contradictory system, so it cannot be true. They were justified in thinking so. They were justified a priori, of course. You know how it works, right? They tried to generate this contradiction by denying the fifth postulate, and what they got eventually, you know, after many attempts, they realized, Riemann, Lobachevsky, and the others, that what you get were consistent geometrical systems. So later they had evidence that their formally justified belief was defeasible. That's, I think, something that is there. Some people point to this example. So we had, the Getter, the famous article by Getter about why the traditional definition of knowledge as justified true belief doesn't work. Now, it's controversial historically this is accurate, but as a rational reconstruction of the history of the debate on what knowledge is, it works well. So the idea is, people, if they had really thought in that way, like Plato, I think Plato was the first one to argue that way, they were justified in thinking that knowledge is justified through belief. They were justified until 1961 or 62, when was it? 62, I think. Gettier came out with these 2-page articles, the only thing he wrote really in his career that made him world famous. The idea that they are counterexamples to this. If now, last night we mentioned that, if now I'm a supporter of Juventus, which I'm not, fortunately, but let's assume I'm the Juventus soccer club, and I watch the last game of the championships in TV, and Juventus wins, and I believe that Juventus has won the championship because of this victory. And actually, it's true that Juventus has won the championship. I have a true belief that is justified. Unfortunately, what I saw in television was an old match from some years ago. I'm not very expert, so I was confused. My evidence for believing a true, for entertaining a true belief, the evidence was not the right kind of evidence. So I was justified. I saw the Juventus game. I thought it was the one that proved that Juventus had won the championship, so I believe that Juventus had won the championship. But I was wrong about what the evidence was. So I had wrong evidence to infer the right conclusion. So this is a typical Gettier example to prove that it's not true that justified true belief is a good definition of knowledge, because you need something more instead, some causal connection between your beliefs and the way of justifying them, and what really is the world. So this is just, we don't care about this particularly now. We only care about the idea that you can do a priori analysis of what knowledge is, come out with this theory that seems perfectly plausible, knowledge is justified true belief, and then give a counterexample, a very plausible, actually. No, I don't know anybody who really denies that Gettier's counterexample really defeat the standard theory. There are plenty of really they changed the methods there. So it's a way of proving that what was obtained a priori, a justified belief, was defeasible. Okay, that was the fourth. There are 8, so we are midway. Okay, so this is another chart. People think that only necessary truths could be justified a priori. But as I said, there are people who are not happy with the idea of necessary truths, something like truths that are valid in all possible worlds. Some people are not happy with the idea of other possible worlds. People think, okay, let's be connected with the only world that exists. This is what really naturalists should do, some people say. So they refuse the idea of possible world, the idea of model logic, all these things. And so they say, if a priori justified beliefs are connected with this, with the idea of necessity, who cares about this? However, you can even justify a false belief. So a false belief certainly is not something that is necessary. So the thesis there is already falsified by this obvious example. You can going back to the non-Euclidean example, the non-Euclidean geometry examples, people had a false belief that, denying that Euclid's postulate would generate a contradictory system. Well, you deny that, you get a false belief. You were justified in holding that belief, but it was false. So this proves simply that it's not true that you can only justify a priori necessary truths, because of course, false beliefs are not necessary truths. They are not truths at all, a priori. They are necessary truths. Also, there is the controversial point that Kripke that's worth considering, and perhaps Wittgenstein. I don't remember why I put Wittgenstein there. I think maybe it could be wrong. But, anyway, the idea that there are some contingent truths that can be known a priori. Oh, no, actually, Kripke, Wittgenstein, I'll tell you why. Is correct. So there are some contingent truths according to Kripke and Wittgenstein, and Wittgenstein, that is the monster philosopher generated by the proof. There are some contingent truths that can be known a priori. And that's the example Kripke gives. The standard meter in Paris is 1 meter long. This is not a necessary truth. It's a contingent truth in some sense, because there can be possible other situations in which the standard measure in Paris is not 1 meter long, and you can do this, of course, by postulating other possible worlds in which this is not the case. But you can also think of this case. Let's assume that now we have other ways of measuring things. We know that in Paris, because of some phenomena, perhaps overheating, the meter has dilated. So it's longer. It's not 1 meter again anymore. So you can think of this is something that, a question of the definition, but still you can have evidence that is false, so it seems to be a contingent truth, I think. So even this doesn't work. 6. And this is based on Quine's attack on, supposed attack on analyticity as such. I think Quine is a little more sophisticated because he accepts some analytical truths, like logical truths. He doesn't say anything about analytical truths. He doesn't deny that there are such things. He only talks about some other definitional truths and attacks them, perhaps. But anyway, that's the trap. Only analytic truths could be justified a priori, right? If it's true, and as a naturalist, people think you deny that there are analytical truths, who cares about a priori justification, right? Well, first of all, there is still some people that can't view that there are synthetic a priori judgments, but you can have, again, a priori justification of false propositions, and false prepositions can't be analytical first. So again, all these statements have universal quantifiers, right? So for all analytic truths, or allegedly analytic truths, for all justified a priori truths, they have to be analytic, and we have counterexamples to this. So this statement is false. Okay, I think another case. 7th. Empirically, one can see that there is a deep disagreement about rational intuitions. So they can't offer an inadequate justification for our beliefs. That's interesting. It's very up to date. I think Genevieve Marti will talk about this later on, today or tomorrow. I don't know when. When is your talk? Tomorrow. So you will wait until tomorrow to know him better. But let me say something in anticipation. Why this kind of empirical philosophy doesn't really solve the problem here? I repeat the argument. The argument is they went around, Stitch and his followers, very good philosophers also, Nichols, my friend Adina Roskis, they went, did this kind of empirical investigations about what people's intuitions really are. So, for example, it's typical in the free will debate. They interview, if you're a professor, who do you interview? You interview your students, right? They are there before the final. You go in class and do this test. They will obey. And you ask them, what do you think? What your intuitions are? And then they give these scenarios in order to understand if our intuitions about freedom are more compatibilist or perhaps skeptic about freedom or libertarian. You test them. And you come out with this scenarios in which you see. That's the point, that different cultures respond differently to this kind of interview. So if you take students from Serbia, probably they will respond differently from students from Asia. That's a typical, so let's say European, Anglo-American cultures generate different views and intuitions about philosophical issues from Asian cultures, okay? That's idea. So if an Asian student has a different intuition, taking as, the representative of the culture, has a different intuition compared with the European or American student, doesn't this prove that your rational intuitions are not really universal? So how can you base your allegedly a priori justification of rational intuitions if they are not really universal? What kind of justification is this? Certainly it's not a priori you are thinking of. That's the kind of thing. I don't think this is very convincing for several reasons. The first one, I strongly think that, the first one, when you think about philosophical intuitions, you don't think about intuitions of people who haven't really worked on philosophy for several years. I mean, you should test the intuitions of people that are not, students, first-year students or so, because it's like going around to mathematics students, first-year students, asking them what they think about, a continuum hypothesis. Who cares? they don't have the expertise there to understand what this is. So first point, this polls, and I think really tell much about our philosophical intuitions. Philosophical intuitions are very sophisticated things, generally. Think about the idea of compatibilism or libertarianism. If you know, now I would say honestly that I don't sympathize with compatibilism very much in the free will debate, but you have to recognize this. Most of the students start as libertarians, and then they study, they read all the classic incompatibilism, and then they become compatibilists. Their intuitions change. Is this irrational? Not at all. Intuitions can change. And so this is the first objection to this kind of philosophy, but empirical philosophy. The second point, I think it's not just intuitions that we should care here, but also arguments and reasons you offer in favor of different intuitions. It could be that we have competing intuitions, and actually I think this is the case. I understand both the libertarian, the skeptic, and the compatibilist intuition. Sometimes I see the strength of each of them, and then I decide, judging a priori, which is the strongest. Okay? I do conceptual analysis. This is conceptual analysis. Comparing different intuitions I have, and to see what is the strongest. And I can change my mind, and so this is what philosophy is. But I don't think the point of disagreement about intuitions is so important, because intuitions, of course, we have disagreements, because we have internal disagreement. I'm, torn. I don't know exactly what intuitions about freedom are the ones that are more interesting, but that's philosophy. So it's not a good argument. And also, as I said, a priori justifications are not only about intuitions. You can evaluate different intuitions. So in order to justify your views, it's not that you only have one intuition, you have to compare different intuitions, but also about deductions, right? Inference steps, and so this is not affected anyway. If you look at a deduction, you see that the conclusion derives, is correctly drawn from the premise. This is based on a priori justification, and this is not connected with our intuitions so much. So the point is that all our intuitions have a normative component that can be evaluated. How you should draw consequences from these intuitions, and then you evaluate the consequences. So intuitions is a complicated matter. People, when they think of a priori justification, sometimes think about this, mystical intuition. You have a clear-cut idea, is there, full-blooded, clear, unshakable. Doesn't work that way. We don't have this kind of intuitions. Certainly, they are not the kind of intuitions that are interesting in philosophy, with one exception. Peter Van Wegen. Who knows Peter Van Wegen? Knows that he has the most solid, unshakable intuitions, and he thinks that if you don't share that, you're wrong. But I think either Peter is very lucky, or I think he has a wrong approach to what philosophical intuitions should be. Okay, now, some people, including John Dupre, would argue that way against the idea that there is something as a priori justification. They argue from a naturalistic point of view that this is not the case. Even if Dupre is more or less a liberal naturalist, I think is not happy with a priori justification. And the idea is that, because he's a strong empiricist, he thinks that there is not really a priori justification in scientific methodology. Something that is not really what's the core of methodology. The core of methodology is the typical empiricist methodology. So you are only connected to results. And but I think Dupre is consistent, because he refuses parts of science, and even on mathematics. I tried to ask him, what about mathematics? And he doesn't respond to that. I'm agnostic about that. But agnostic here is an easy way out, I think. But even in physics, it's kind of a revisionist. He doesn't accept theories that don't have empirical evidence that support them. But that means to be strongly revisionist about what science is. Strongly revisionist. If you take Galileo, for example, the beginning of modern science, Galileo used the a priori method a lot in order to justify his views. Alexander Quidre famously wrote that Galileo didn't do any experimental work. These are being shown wrong. Galileo did some experiments. Stephen Drake has positively proved that, for example, about the laws of gravitation, the idea that there is a mathematical regularity when in acceleration of bodies when they fall. This was done, verified empirically. But if you go to astronomy, he became a Copernican without any good support. Eventually he came out with a wrong, but eventually it was already Copernican with a supposed, what he supposed was a good proof. He thought about the tides, right? The tides would prove this is the dialogue of the two main ship systems in the world. So because we have tides in the seas, this proves that the Earth moves. That's wrong. Tides depend on the attraction of the movement particle of the sun. It's not due to the movement of the Earth. But so he didn't have any good proof. And also this came late. The reason for which he became a Copernican was a strictly philosophical one. He believed that the Copernican system was simpler than the Ptolemaic system. And it was very much simpler. And he thought, how could we accept the Ptolemaic system that is composed of 64 or 68, depending on the systems, spheres, glassy spheres on which the planets would move, with very strange movements. For example, Mercury would come back, do really very strange movements in order to account for what our experiences in looking at the skies are. So if you are a follower of Ptolemaeus, you have to accept the idea that there are these 68 glassy spheres on which the planets do these incredibly strange movements. Each planet does 3 or 4 different kinds of movements. And then Copernicus comes out with this system in which planets only do one kind of movement. And so this is enough for Galileo. He didn't have any empirical evidence. If he was a scientific naturalist, he shouldn't become a Copernican. But of course, the fact that he became a Copernican was very important for the Copernicanism itself. Perhaps Copernicanism would have had to wait more decades, perhaps centuries, if no one that had done this step by accepting it a priori, substantially. Okay? Because you have two systems and you evaluate a priori, the one is better because it's more simple. There is a strong metaphysical idea here. Simplicity as the sign of truth. Yeah, this idea of a geometrical God, right? But this is something that many physicists still accept. Simplicity is one of the reasons, only one of course, but for accepting the theory. If there are two competing theories in physics, categories, you pick the simplest, unless you are the proponent of the other, that you don't care about simplicity stuff. Another case is general relativity, and Einstein's view was largely accepted before any empirical evidence. The empirical evidence came later. And the reason was that it was so simple and so not only simple, it could account for an incredible range of phenomena and make interesting predictions that no one had tested. For example, the movement of Mercurius, right? No one knew that this was true, that it would have generated, no one was sure that it would have generated a true prediction. But people voted just because of his epistemic virtues, simplicity, fecundity, and all these things, a priori. So there was an important a priori component of Einstein's theory. And nowadays, for example, take string theory. Some people don't even accept it. The most radical naturalists don't accept string theory because no one is sure that string theory has empirical applications. So even now, but many people do, many physicists do string theory. And this is done really more or less a priori because there are no concrete applications yet. This is the argument. I think that this argument is wrong, this claim is wrong just because it's not true that a priori justification plays a role in science. It's not true. And if you think so, you are wrong about what a naturalist is committed to. This is kind of an argument I offer, vaguely inspired by Putnam. It's very simple, nothing special, but I think it gives an idea. So, mathematical statements play an indispensable role in the natural sciences, particularly in physics. This is another argument I'm offering. So, notwithstanding what Hartree-Field famously said, trying to, doing physics without mathematics, and he came out with this incredibly complicated system that, only accounted for a very little part of Newtonian physics. But nothing more than that. It was actually not usable. It was too complicated, only using logic instead of mathematics. So the point is that no one seriously doubts that you need to use mathematics in order to do science, physics, nowadays, okay? It is indispensable. And notwithstanding what Philip Kitcher says, mathematical statements are justified a priori. Kitcher has a particular definition of the a priori for which mathematics is not a priori. But still, I think if you take the writer's account of what a priori is, and 99% of the people think, or something like that, or the philosophers of mathematics think that mathematical statements are justified a priori. Okay? And so, consequently, a priori justification plays a fundamental role also within the natural sciences. And this is part Penelope Meddu thinks that this is not true, that there is no a priori in the science. And in order to do that, she has to argue that mathematics is not real, like not really a priori, and blah, blah, blah. I think that this is really implausible. So I think that this is an argument that proves that rejecting the possibility of a priori justification contradicts the basic credo of scientific naturalism. Because, I repeat, I'm a liberal naturalist. I don't think that philosophers should be confined within the methods of science. But scientific naturalism thinks so. And I grant that point now for the sake of my argument. Well, if you accept the idea that philosophy should buy the methods used by science, and you buy this argument, you should also accept the idea that a priori analysis and justification is acceptable, because it's part of science. So how could you refuse this? I don't remember. Some people have tried to argue that this is not true, that, you know, I will skip this. How many minutes? 5, 3, 2, 1, 0? Minus 1? Okay. Then some people say that this is...
right to 5, but if you can do it less, it's better.
Okay, I will do less. Some people argue that this is not true, that there are counterexamples, but these counterexamples can be countered looking at the history of science very easily, I think. But I won't go through this. It's just to say that it's not true that you can have a convincing example for the fact that scientists refuse their a priori arguments. But so, and this is the counter arguments I have, but really that's not necessary. The idea is simply that if you look at the history of physics, for atomism, for example, people got the atomic theory for granted, even if they didn't have any experience. In this interesting book, Jack Ritchie comes out with this, taken from Maddie, actually, this example. Look, at the beginning of the 1900, people didn't really buy the theory, atomistic theory, because they didn't have any concrete experience. So only after Perrin proved that there were empirical consequences coming out of the atomic theory, they bought atomism. That's not true. There were many atomists like Boltzmann, many atomists before, and also the point is that the example it shows, that they chose, Maddie and Ritchie chose, is very peculiar, because at that point, philosophy of science and science was so much influenced by Ernst Mach, instrumentalism, anti-realism. So it's a peculiar period. But eventually, I think that now most of the reconstructions in the history of science don't agree with them, that you can prove that scientists as a group don't accept a priori methods. Okay, so my conclusions. You see? I've seen some leading naturalists like Quine, David Maddy, reject the legitimacy of a priori justification. Yes. However, these rejections are not really vindicated by the actual practices of science or by any other empirical elements of conceptual reason. So, because scientific naturalists are so happy to say that philosophy should accept the methods of science, their views are not justified looking at how science works. So, I think the idea of a priori justification is perfectly acceptable, and actually should be accepted by all naturalists, including the scientific, not just the liberal, also the scientific naturalists, because not doing so would violate the credo of even the scientific naturalists, right? Their credo is do philosophy as you do science. Well, in science we use a priori justification credo, so you should be happy with it. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
But he makes a very clear distinction. He says, although all of our knowledge arises from experience, not all of our knowledge derives from experience. And that's exactly, and he's arguing against that in the tests, that saying that later on he argues against independence by saying, look, that discussion that is that rationalism versus about independence has to be moved away the real distinctions between the a priori and the a posteriori. And it seems to me that this distinction between arising and deriving is precisely the idea that if you're devoid of any experience, you will never acquire any concept. Right? Another thing is after you have the concept that you can put two and two together. So I just think that for your first rejoined reply to the
Kant would agree.
It's just like, no, I think that all you have to tell is just read the first page of the critique of your reason.
I agree entirely, Genoveva. As I said, this is how people tend to read Kant. They say, okay, let's talk about the view, right? They say this is the way in which Kant, of course Kant is criticized, I try to say at least that. I don't want to be philologically accurate here because I would entirely agree with you. I'm presenting the view that they criticize and sometimes attribute to Kant. I don't want to say that Kant would disagree with them because this is irrelevant here. What is really, because I'm entirely by your point, but they wouldn't be happy. They would say, okay, forget Kant. Let's take this view that is how people are conceived of their priority.
He's a strong man, right?
Yeah, something like that. But even let's assume that this is interesting to see why that view, Kant or not Kant, is wrong. That's not what a priori is. About innatism, I totally agree with you. I tried to say that the innatism, that's probably not the correct word, but is transcendental, it's not genetic like the empiricist. So something like every rational human being has these a priori categories. Innatism in this sense that a rational mind is born with these transcendental categories and these are given a priori, something like that. But I totally agree with that.
Okay. I also have a number of questions, but isn't that the argument that, now I'm trying to think why would somebody say that, but isn't that really the argument that, for example, in terms of causal ordering, really we are not, so why do we believe that cause comes before the effect? It has nothing to do, like the reason why that comes before has nothing to do with the actual content of the experience. So the principle itself, in a way, works.
So it's not about the genetics.
Yeah, devoid of experience that then kind of apply to experience, something like that. I mean,
that's very important. What you're saying is, okay, let's grant this, but then could reply that way. It's not the genesis of the concept, but that's the content of the concept. And then, I agree with you.
In terms of the content,
but then, I would argue, like you have done in your own talk, that look, this view of causation is so old-fashioned, right? That how can you think this is a priori? Really, even if you talk about a priori about causation, you really need some kind of work. Yeah, to do work. I agree with you. That's a good point.
Now, one thing that I don't think you mentioned, but it sort of ties to what you said at a couple of places is to sort of play devil's advocate here.
Which one? Which number?
Well, in general, those who defend the view that a priori reasoning doesn't really have to do anything with scientific methodology. I think one of the main motives for that kind of argument comes from something that's related to this, but it's not explicitly anywhere in your notes. It's really the fear that although we can say that a priori a priori concepts are fallible, for example, so we don't have to be committed to the view that they are infallible, they do tell us in a way what is acceptable and what is not acceptable as a concept. So the idea that, okay, we think of a concept and then by a priori analysis we decide whether something is so acceptable or unacceptable.
That's good.
And then naturalists are often afraid of that in terms of scientific methodology. For example, Liam was really against a priori, I think primarily because of that reason, because he thought, well, look what kind of damage that did in the history to science. For example, when Newton came up with his theory of gravitation, he said, you know, you have one object, another object, and there is some interaction between them. I have no idea what that force is, but look, they interact in this precise manner. I can predict actually accurately their interaction. Mechanists attack him. So people who, philosophers, scientists who believe that the conceptual framework of science is a mechanism of some sort.
That's very interesting.
And why did they believe that? Well, you know, their a priori reasoning told them that's the way to understand natural systems, and what Newton is talking about is kind of astrology.
Yeah,
he borrowed that from astrologists.
That's funny.
He did. So,
that's very interesting, because I don't think you agree with them, because what they are doing is Newton should have done what he had done. And so we shouldn't have had the Newtonian revolution. That I think is a strong point for a naturalist. That actually is a reduction of that view. Newton did what he did, and actually, as you know, investigated a lot in the most Spanish ways to understand what this gravitation was. He did, you know, alchemy, he did everything to understand. But he accepted it as a fact, even if he had no good explanation, as you said, a priori. I totally agree. And the Bonjour is interesting here, because he says, what is a priori analysis? One interesting case is this. He says, a priori analysis studies the properties of an entity if this entity exists. So he says, science or the empirical investigation will tell us if something exists. And a priori analysis will tell us what properties these things will have. Something like that. And I think that this is a good way of putting it. And think about the string theories. If strings exist, we'll know what properties they have, but what properties they have will be known a priori, more or less. So that's exactly
it's more modest. Yeah.